Hi, this is Andy Hunt at Practical Wellbeing, and I'd like to welcome you to another of the short tapping videos demonstrating different techniques that I use in my practice and that you can use for yourself to help things move along. In standard EFT we have just the simple process of tapping on the negative emotion, whatever it is, to bring down the negative emotional state until the system is calm and settled and more resourceful. So in standard EFT, very familiar to anyone who's done tapping. In this technique called Paradoxical Tapping, we're going to use the tapping to kind of bridge from a negative state to a positive state, kind of like an antidote state, if you like. And the way we're going to do that bridging is by just using a very simple and familiar word, the word "and". So if you want to kind of go from a state, let's say for example you're tapping on like you feel like you're having a struggle. So for example you feel like you're having a struggle. You could just do standard EFT. I'm struggling, I'm struggling, I'm struggling, I'm struggling, I'm struggling, until the charge on struggling drops and drops and drops and drops. So, but the question is, if we can kind of find some way to bring an antidote to struggle, how can we combine those two states? So for me, the opposite of struggle would be to say that I'm thriving. Now your opposite of struggle might be quite different. This is the opposites of things. Is a kind of personal matter. What's my opposite is my opposite, and what's your opposite be your opposite. They might not be the same thing. So in this case we're going to use the opposite of struggle to be thriving. So on the one hand we've got struggling, and on the other hand we've got thriving. So how can we bring those two states together so that we can use the idea of thriving to kind of soften the experience of struggling? And one way of doing that is just to use a very simple word, the word "and". So we have such and such and something else. So struggling and thriving. So the simplest version, and this is the first version of paradoxical tapping I came up with, went something like this. Now I'm going to use the struggling and thriving example. If you have something going on for you and you want to kind of tap along using your own experience, that's great, so please do that. But I'm going to use struggling and thriving. Now the first version of paradoxical tapping went something like this. So even though I'm struggling, I accept myself and how I feel. Even though I'm struggling, I accept myself and how I feel. Even though I'm struggling, I accept myself and how I feel. I am struggling and I am thriving. 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 Now, as you can imagine, there's part of my mind doing that simple version is going on the "and I am thriving." You go, oh no you're not. All the kind of tail enders, the resistance to the idea of thriving kind of comes up, and that kind of blocks the effect, this kind of merging effect brought on by the "and". So there's struggle going on with accepting thriving. So I've adapted that slightly, so taking that as a start point, kind of join these two things together. The question is how to soften the acceptance of the idea that you can thrive, or you can have the opposite of the problem. And the way I've done that is by changing thriving into a question, and more than that, a hypothetical question. Because we're very susceptible to questions. If I ask you, what have you had for breakfast? What did you eat for breakfast? What happens? You probably get an answer. Something kind of pops into your head, oh I had this, I did this. We're suckers for questions. That's why game shows are so popular. We're suckers for questions. Ask you a question or ask yourself a question and the mind goes off searching for answers. So we're going to put it in as a question, and to make it easier for the brain to ask the question, we're going to make it a hypothetical question. So the wording now is, I am struggling and in how many different ways could I be thriving? So instead of just a blanket, I'm struggling, I'm thriving, it goes an invitation to the mind to consider the number of different ways that it could be thriving. So it's hypothetical. We can all think of hypothetical answers to things, that's not a problem. And it's phrased as a question. This tends to go in much more easily. So I'm going to do around now this kind of like second version, the Mark II version of paradoxical tapping. So even though I'm struggling, I accept myself and how I feel. Even though I'm struggling, I accept myself and how I feel. Even though I'm struggling, I accept myself and how I feel. I'm struggling, and in how many different ways could I be thriving? I'm struggling, and in how many different ways could I be thriving? I'm struggling, and in how many different ways could I be thriving? I am struggling, and in how many different ways could I be thriving? Now internally for me, the experience of that is very different. This kind of putting it as a hypothetical question means that the idea can slip in very, very easily. There's no resistance to it because it's a question and because it's hypothetical. So that version tends to go much more smoothly, at least in my experience, goes much more smoothly than the first one, which is a bit of a kind of a tall order to go straight from struggle to thrive in one go. That's too much. This makes it much easier to entertain both possibilities simultaneously. But there's more. There's just one extra piece that I've added, and that piece is just one word, and the word is now. So what I want to do here is use the word now to become a sort of a command, a way of taking this hypothetical and injecting it into the system as a command. So let's do a full round of the paradoxical tapping, adding in all the pieces. So even though I'm struggling, I accept myself and how I feel. Even though I'm struggling, I accept myself and how I feel. Even though I'm struggling, I accept myself and how I feel. I'm struggling, and in how many different ways could I be thriving now? I'm struggling, and in how many different ways could I be thriving now? I'm struggling, and in how many different ways could I be thriving now? I'm struggling, and in how many different ways could I be thriving now? So that's the whole sequence, basically. It's a very simple, once you get the hang of the words, a very simple tapping routine. All that's needed is the problem state and the opposite, if you like, or the antidote state. Those are the two things you need to provide, and then slot them into that tapping script or those tapping phrases, the template. Even though I problem, and in how many different ways could I opposite now? Okay, if we put it in that kind of format, problem and opposite, negative state, positive state, joined together by an and in how many different ways could I now? That's it. So I hope that helps, and please give this a go. I'd be really interested to hear from you how this works out for you. You can find my contact details on my webpage, which is demonstrated below, and also on the last page of this. And paradoxical tapping is one of the techniques in my ebook, the EFT Collection, 12 tapping techniques for practical well-being. And you can find that on my website as well. So I hope you found this helpful, and I look forward to being with you again. Thanks now. Bye-bye.